The Spot Track Podcast, talking sports contracts, the salary cap, and business of sports.
Hello and welcome to another edition of the Spot Track Podcast, SpotTrack.com. Mike Giannetti here, of course, the founder of SpotTrack.com. I'm Kevin Sylvester. No Paul today, but we'll somehow find a way to survive. He doesn't know anything about taxes anyways. We're going to talk a lot about taxes today with athletes.
Yeah, that's right. We're going to have a special guest, a colleague of mine from the past few years working with Spot Track. His name is Robert Raiola. He's an agent, a lawyer, an accountant. He's got all the buttons checked here. So we're going to speak to him a little bit, kind of talk about the various sports, player salaries, things like that, all the issues that could be taxable and what that means going forward.
We are going to learn a lot with Robert Raiola.
A lot of math. Great place to start, Robert, is the issue of the highest paid football player, Kirk Cousins out of the Washington Redskins. If you can maybe just give us a synopsis of, his pay structure, how that works, and how the tax kind of evolves with that.
Sure. First of all, on his pay structure, Mike and Kevin, most of the players are only paid in the NFL are only paid during the season. The one exception being the Tennessee Titans, which pay you somewhat during the season, but also carry it over until like March of the following year. So Kurt's probably getting his check every week or every 2 weeks. The interesting issue there is the Redskins practice in Virginia and play their home games in Maryland. So players are paying tax to the state that they play in or other states based on duty days. So Kirk would pay tax mostly on that income, mostly to the state of Virginia, because that's where he is 5 days a week on a home game and 6 days a week. 5 days a week on a road game, 6 days a week on a home game, and then he would play tax to Maryland just on the days that they play there, which would probably be just Sundays during the preseason and the regular season. So, again, let's not feel sorry for him because he may be paid weekly, but he's paid strong in the pocket, and he does get a lot of money, and the franchise tag has worked out for him so far.
What if he takes a day off? Does it count as a work? I'm just thinking tax implications. If they go out a couple days early to another state, I mean, who keeps track of this stuff?
Yeah, that falls on mostly on the accountant. But the interesting thing, that Kevin, that's a great point. Last year there was a couple teams that headed west. I think the Miami Dolphins had back-to-back West Coast games, so it was interesting. We figured out that it cost the Dominican Sue. The Dolphins went out west, and I don't know who they played, the Rams and the Raiders or whoever it was, the Rams and the Chargers. So instead of coming back east in between games, they stayed over there. And they wound up spending, maybe 12 days in California as opposed to 3 or 4. So it cost the players a lot of money, and with no state tax in Miami, it cost, Sue a lot of money out of his pocket. Interesting enough, I think the Eagles in a couple of weeks are going to they've got back-to-back games in the West Coast against Seattle and another California team. I realize Seattle's not in California, but they're going to stay, the word I have is they're staying out there, so that'll cost the players a little bit of money. But I think the Panthers also had back-to-back games in California. So it's very important that you keep track of the days, and just because the team puts it on the W-2 doesn't mean that's correct.
Hey, Robert, how aware are the players of this?
I'm sorry? I missed the question.
How aware are the players of this situation, like while this is happening, this West Coast swing?
I think, it was funny that you mentioned that because one of the West Coast teams, they may have played, Seattle first, and they were going to California team, but they wound up training in California, so it wound up costing them more money, when they do that. Some guys are aware, some are not, and the teams don't really care what Robert says or if it costs the players a little bit more tax. And what I always like to do, and I use social media a lot for this, is I pointed out, and I would never use any of my clients as an example, but I would just say, take the highest paid player on the team, and of course, when I want to find out the highest paid player on the team, I go to SpotRack and I look it up there, very accessible website, and I find out, who the highest paid player is, and I do a quick and dirty calculation to just estimate what it would cost. Some players are aware, some are not. If, in the case of a guy playing for a California team, the Jock tax doesn't really matter in the other states because California has the highest tax rate, 13.3%. So if he plays in Illinois, which just raised it to almost 5%, it doesn't matter. He'll get a full credit in California. But when you're playing for the Dolphins, we mentioned before in the Dominican Sue, and he spends 2 weeks in California that he wasn't expected to, that could hit him a little bit hard in the pocket. Some are aware, some are not.
We're talking about football here at the start. What about the international games? Games in London. We just had a game in Mexico City. How does the tax work when they're earning money internationally?
Sure. With London, the problem there, Kevin, is that the top tax rate in London is 45%. Our tax rate back here currently 39.6%. So if player X goes to London and he pays 45%, he can only get a credit back here at 39. So let's take this an example. You take a Los Angeles Ram, I think, who played there early in the year. So they're paying, get this, 45% to London, to UK, 13.3% to California. With some of the other payroll taxes, boom, if you get a $10,000 paycheck, you're only getting $4,000 in the pocket. Oh. And this is a user-friendly show, but I will just say that stinks, and the players don't use those words. If you know what I mean.
Yeah, that's kind of tough. Some fans might look at it, we're going to take a road trip to London, while the players are like, ooh, we're taking a road trip to London.
And it's because that's a great point, Kevin, and because of the high taxes and the travel, that's why I'm not so sure the NFL will ever have a permanent team there. It's funny because every time I talk, a team goes to London, I talk about, what the players may pay. I think the NFL is aware of this, and I think that they would try to put in some tax equalization or something to make, if they were to base a team there full time, where the players wouldn't be, hit by the higher rate. Especially if our rate's going to go down, but as we see in the House and Senate bill, who knows where rates are right now? And even if those two are passed, then they got to reconcile and try to figure something between. But players don't like to go to London. It could be worse. You could be playing hockey in Toronto. The top tax rate in the province, federal and provincial tax rate in the city of Toronto is 53.5%. So that's also kind of tough in the pocket, and that affects all the sports except for the NFL.
Yeah, so let's stay there, Robert. In terms of the difference, what is the difference between the NFL versus the other sports here, right?
Sure. Great question, Michael. The issue in all sports, most of the states use a duty days method as opposed to the games played method. I think you guys both located somewhere in the wonderful state of New York, way back when New York had the games played method and they switched over to duty days method. If you think about it, even though in most sports half the games are at home and half on the road, with the NFL, the practice time is so much weighted towards the state that you are based in. You take an example of a guy playing on the Raiders right now. 85% of his income is earned in the state of California, taxing at the top tax rate of 13.3%. When they go to Nevada, 85% of the income will be earned there, and even though that playing half the games on the road, it's based on duty days, not on games, and that'll be a good thing. So Derek Carr and the rest of the crew will save a ton of money when the team goes to Nevada, especially if the House and Senate get their way, and they take the ability of a taxpayer, the ability to deduct state and local taxes as a deduction on your federal return. If that goes away, boy, oh boy. In free agency, Mike, I know you like to put out where guys may go in free agency, you're going to see a big hit. The California teams and the teams in the high tax state, Minnesota, they're going to have to really have to pay their players higher to make up for that loss of that deduction.
Yeah, let's actually stay there as well. In terms of free agency, I mean, it sure sounds like it's a major impact in terms of where guys end up. I mean, our agents, I mean, who's kind of pressing the tax issue when it comes down to the free agent signing?
Sure. Michael, I think if we keep it with football, there's a bunch of issues that come up. If I'm a defensive player, do they play 3-4? Do they play 4-3? Do we have a chance to win a Super Bowl? Do I know the defensive coordinator from somewhere? So there are a bunch of issues that are probably more important than taxes. But as we know, and as I tweet often, it's not the gross, it's the net. And if you think about it, the best gross deal may not be the best net deal. Well, by that I mean, $10 million from the Raiders is not the same as $10 million from the Dolphins. Give you an example on that. When Ndamukong Suh was a free agent, he signed for $60 million gross, type of money that Mike Ginty gets paid. Sorry, butchered the last name. Gets paid for doing this radio show. He got that net to Florida. He would have netted about $36 million. If the Lions wanted to match that, they would have had to pay him $65 and eat further into that cap. And if the Raiders wanted to match it, they would have had to pay him $70.1, which is $10.1 million more than Dolphins. That's not really fair. And I know in the NBA they talked about maybe making the cap on an after-tax basis, but that hasn't happened. It was talked about. And I had an NBA team call me and ask me about that. But with some planning, you can get around this, but not so much in football. It worked. There's some signing bonus issues you can do, like Clayton Kershaw, but in baseball, and Dodgers, but really not easy to do that in football because of the language in the contract.
Yeah, net's a great way to remember Mike Giannetti. With that,
I should know a couple of vowels of my name too. Sorry about that.
No, all good. What you just stated there about the state of Florida is why when Steven Stamkos His contract was coming up with the Tampa Bay Lightning. I kept maintaining on a radio show I was doing. There is no way he's leaving Tampa Bay to go play in Toronto. Everybody thought he was going to play because of the tax issue. I mean, 53% as opposed to not paying state income tax in the state of Florida. It was a no-brainer for him to stay there.
Kevin, I couldn't agree with you more, and I wrote an article with a fellow from the Tampa Bay Times about that. And when it came to, we did it in January, and then when it came to June, he was looking to sign, and I put out no way he was there, he was going to sign it. I didn't get hate mail or hate tweets, but I got some little bit threatening, not the stuff from, he's going to earn so much more money from the Canadian fans if he goes to, Montreal or Toronto. You were right. There's no way. To focus further on your point, he would have had to make a couple $1 million more a year, and he wasn't going to make that much more in endorsements to go there. So there was no way he was going to leave the friendly confines of Florida for Toronto, even though he was Canadian. And the problem is when an American player goes up there and plays for an American team like a New York Ranger player or a Buffalo Sabre player, he's treaty protected. He doesn't pay Canadian tax. However, in Michael's, in Kevin's case, if he a Canadian player who's of Canadian descent, Canadian citizen, Canadian resident, if he went up there, he would pay tax at 53.5% on all his income. There was no way that was going to happen. No matter what the fans wanted to say, it just wasn't going to be. Because again, that's a classic example of the best gross deal. The Canadians, at the least, would have paid him more. Wouldn't be the best net deal.
You mentioned endorsements, and I'm curious about permanent residents or full-time residents, and if that's where endorsement money is earned, meaning the football player who plays for the Minnesota Vikings, yet his full-time off-season residence is in the state of Texas, no state income tax. Does that and he gets an endorsement deal with Coca-Cola for $1 million a year? Does he pay tax? What rate does he pay the tax on?
Sure. Federally wise, obviously, Kevin, I know you know this, but it's the same either way, right? But for state tax purposes, if as part of that requirement from Coca-Cola, he's got to go to a mall in Minnesota and sign some autograph and do an appearance, I might apportion that to Minnesota. However, if it's just a national deal and he's really not doing any work in Minnesota, I think that you would be in good shape there. But a lot of times guys will go sign autographs, like you see in the Houston Nationals now, doing a ton of shows. Obviously, if that's in Texas, it's not taxable there. If they do shows somewhere else in like California it would be taxable there. But again, you can't tell a guy he can't do a show in his own state, like if he's playing for the Vikings. But in your example, if it was a national deal and he didn't do any work for that in Minnesota, I don't think you'd have to worry about taxes there.
Hey, Robert, just to kind of wrap things up here, really appreciate this, by the way. You kind of mentioned that there was some inkling with the NBA that they may go to a situation where everything would be after tax to kind of account for this. Teams that could then account for their own current state tax situation. Is that a growing thing? Are you feeling that kind of presence with other leagues? I mean, we've got a couple of CBAs that are coming up here, the NHL for sure. Baseball is going to come back around soon. Is this something that may be an issue with other sports and could actually possibly happen?
I'll tell you why it was an issue in basketball, and it was touched upon when they were talking about the new CBA. I talked to a team the day after the trading deadline about 2 years ago. And they were trying to get a player who was traded from the West Coast to an East Coast team, one of these team's competitors. And what happened was, in the NBA, Mike, and you know as well as I do, if the player is your own free agent, I believe you can sign him to a 5-year deal. If the player is somebody else's free agent, you could sign him to a 4-year deal. So what happened to this team was they were trying to get the player, and they didn't. He wound up going to the Miami Heat. So they knew the combination of the longer deal, vis-a-vis 5 versus 4, and no state income tax in Florida, they knew they had no shot, to get the player. And he wound up signing with Miami as a free agent that summer. But it's been talked about a little in basketball, not so much in the other sports. I think we got to see how the state, the House and the Senate bills shake out. But it's been talked about a little bit because in the example that we delineated about the Dominican Sue, it's a big advantage, to the teams with no state tax, and the Raiders are getting the worst of it right now, and they would get the better of it when they went to Vegas. But I don't know how soon it would happen, but it's been talked about. And we'd have to let the tax bill shake out to see which way that worked. The team, I'll tell you this for sure: the teams like the Cowboys, the Dolphins, or the Marlins, or whoever, those teams in no tax states in whatever the sport, they push that when they go out and try to sign guys at free agency. And the teams that don't have a big tax, they're going to have to try to work around it. Now there are some workarounds, and we do some planning in most of the sports except for football, but the language in the contract stops that in football. But I think it's important to have a conversation with with some of the GMs and whatnot, and so they understand that, and talk to the players' associations and see where this may go, because it is really an unfair advantage to the teams that play in a no tax state.
Robert, I thought of one more question that I think is pretty interesting, and because we talk about the players, the athletes, when they play in different states, and I'll keep this to NFL. What about the owners? Because when the NFL revenue sharing system, they share revenue in the TV. I still believe they share 35% tickets. So when a team goes to play in another team's state, they get 35% of the ticket revenue from the gate in that building, and you'd have to think there's some profit built in there for the owner. Do owners pay the jock tax, if you will?
Well, it's another great question, Kevin. I think the way I like to look at it, as far as the individual is concerned, any member of the traveling party, Kevin, I think you mentioned did some work in broadcasting for some time. So if you travel with the team and you're a member of the traveling team and you go on the road, you're paying that. You should be paying that jock tax. Okay, so. And this includes referees, coaches, assistant coaches, doctors that travel with the team. I had a situation last year where my son had to get knee surgery, and maybe it was 2 years ago. The Jets the previous night had played in Georgia. And after he did the knee surgery, my son, the next day was a Monday night game, and this happened on Tuesday. I said to him, Doc, I know you were traveling with the team. Do you want to pay the jock tax on the road? He said, absolutely. And he said it's a pain in the butt to do that, but if you're traveling with the team, you're probably paying that tax. And if you regularly travel with the team, you're certainly paying with the tax. The other thing I encourage players all the time is, if you're hurt and you do not travel to the state, if you weren't there, you should be aware. Like, if you get injured and you're not playing the rest of the year, make sure they're not taking out the state taxes on the road if you're not physically present.
Yeah, don't go on the road trip. If they invite you on the road trip, don't go. It's going to cost you.
Robert, really appreciate this. It's been great. I'm sure the listeners are going to love hearing this, and we're hoping to have you back anytime soon.
Yeah, but thanks for having me. You guys have a happy Thanksgiving. Again, I love using the SpotTrack website. Great tool, especially when I'm talking about players' fines and whatnot. And just we'll add one little tidbit for the listeners as well. On the fines, under current law, if the fine is for a violation of a team or league rule, it's tax deductible. If it's a violation of, you get a speeding ticket or public law, not deductible. However, under the proposed tax bills, both the House and the Senate, all these type of expenses would disappear for the players. So it would cost the players even more money if they get fined, because they won't be able to get a tax benefit for it.
You can hear a lot more of that and keep up with Robert on Twitter at SportsTaxman. Robert, thanks again.
Thanks, fellas. All the best. Happy Thanksgiving.
Mike, that was some fascinating stuff just in that short time we had with Robert, and just all the factors that go into it.
Yeah, it's always great to hear that side of it, because it's something that maybe you don't think about when you're looking at these kind of contracts or you're seeing these players in the field, but it's a big part of the business side of it. It's a big part of the decision-making for agents, for teams, for players. And I think, as he laid out there, it's certainly a competitive advantage for those teams in those states where tax really isn't that major of an issue.
Oh, if I were an agent, I would be... those would be the teams I talk to first, right? The teams without a state income tax.
Yeah, it doesn't matter that you're 2-13 as long as there's no state tax,
well,
right?
For some guys, it doesn't matter, right?
That's right.
And if my player was a very marketable guy, I would have him living in a
That's right.
A non-state, income tax state. He'd be Tennessee, Florida, Texas, Nevada. I think those are the only four. Why are there only four, by the way?
I don't know who works harder, a quarterback's accountant or the quarterback. What do you think? I mean, that sounds like a lot of work.
I think the QB's account, and you got to find a good one you can trust. Well, that goes with anybody in life. I mean, even for all the money you make at SpotTrack.com.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
As he liked to point out there. All right. Well, great stuff. You can give out Robert's Twitter handle again, because he's a great follow.
Man, you make sure to follow at SportsTaxman on Twitter.
Today's Cap Fact.
Mike, today's cap fact is really interesting when it comes to starting lineups in the NFL and how they've changed since week 1. And, a lot of it's due to injury, more trades this year in the National Football League. But what did you find out when you looked at the finances of starting lineups from week 1 to week 10?
Yeah, so we dove into this really with the understanding that, there seemed to be more injuries. There were certainly more impactful trades this year. And I really just kind of wanted to see where the rosters stood now in comparison to the start of the year. And, as you might expect, most of, if not almost all of them, 90% of the teams, they've lost, starting dollars in terms of their cap, just based on, players have been injured, younger, cheaper guys have come into the lineup and things like that.
Aaron Rodgers, for example, Green Bay, right?
J.J. Watt, right. Those are the teams that are going to be at the top of this list just because those major cap hits have come off and onto the injured reserve. But really, when you're looking at the different dichotomies of how that may have happened in terms of trades, releases, and the injuries, there's different ways that teams have gone about this, right? And what's most interesting is the team at the top of the list, which would be the Buffalo Bills.
Really?
So what the Bills have done is a little bit of everything, right? They've cut a couple of guys, they've had a couple of injuries, minimal injuries, but their most impactful financial moves were trades away, some trades in, some cheaper trades in, and obviously benching their starting quarterback for a much, much, much cheaper option. So they're kind of hitting all the options, all the buttons in terms of ways you can reduce your cap throughout the year. The question really is how is that impacting their team on the field, which you've seen in the last couple of weeks has been a negative impact. There's other teams who are doing it for, reasons on the field this year. Teams like the Seattle Seahawks, they're just losing guys to injuries every week. So they've had to, bring in trades, bring in things like that, bring in street free agents to kind of make things work on the field this year. The list is interesting. We had a really good look at, teams with major IR caps, right? Like the Miami Dolphins, the Arizona Cardinals, obviously the Packers with Aaron Rodgers, teams like that who, you lose $20 million, week 1 with a major injury, and certainly your lineup is going to change going forward. But there are teams who have been tinkering, teams like the Bills, teams like the Seahawks, teams like the Dallas Cowboys and the Denver Broncos, especially the Cowboys, a very interesting one with the situation with Ezekiel Elliott. They've made so many roster moves to kind of account for the back and forth situation there. That they've really probably dumped cap they didn't need to dump because of the situation. So it's an interesting look. We do track these lineups every single week in terms of the starting lineups for offense, defense, special teams. So this is a tool you can view on SpotTrack. And when we take a look at these reports on a snapshot basis, it's really interesting to see how much money has been shed, how much money has been gained, and how they've done so. It's kind of a team-building exercise for how these teams have gone through the year.
They can also go in and figure out, okay, teams that have had the decrease because of IR trades and are still winning, that equals depth on the
or good moves, or good moves, and maybe
good
that's
point.
Something more we'll see. If teams were able to successfully take in some players by the trade deadline and continue to win, maybe that's a vice that more GMs continue to use.
All right, great stuff that you can find at SpotTrack.com. The Cap Fact with the NFL starting lineups from week 1 to now.
Time now for the contract of the week.
Contract of the week this week, Mike, involves extension season. And so it's more than just one contract. It is contracts of the week.
Yeah, that's right. We took a significant amount of time in the past couple of weeks here to identify some players from every single NFL team who may be in need of an extension, whether that's because they have an expiring contract coming up, whether that they're underpaid or no guaranteed money left on the deal. There's a lot of factors that go into, a need for a team to extend a player.
Right now, everybody's saying nobody's underpaid in the NFL.
That's right. $1 million is still $1 million.
But compared to the rest of the market, the football players are underpaid. Anyhow.
That's right.
I digress.
Air quotes. Right. So Thanksgiving is, obviously a big football week, but this is also a week where we kind of label it as extension season, right? Like you mentioned. This is kind of a point of the season where, GMs and players and agents kind of start talking for that future contract, that next contract. And really, it's a way for teams, if they're involved in that discussion, to kind of jump the gun here, right? To kind of get it, maybe get a better value deal now than during free agency, or now a little farther away from the end of the contract. Teams like the Patriots and those kind of teams that have evolved a little bit more with the cap. They've understood that an earlier extension is just always going to be better value, whether it's 6 months early or 3 months early. And anytime you can get ahead of the gun, it's going to be better for them.
It's the old pay now or pay more later.
That's right. You don't want to fall into the Joe Flacco syndrome where you win a Super Bowl then need a new contract. So, so we've identified some players. We've got a couple of notable ones here. You know, obviously there's players like Aaron Donald who, you know, for the last 12 months with the Rams, he's been sacking quarterbacks. He's been stopping the run. He's been doing everything statistically to warrant a new contract, but he doesn't have a new contract. He held out for week 1 this year. He's done everything I think on his end that he could do, whether that's fair or not. But this is a guy that needs a new contract, and at the end of the day, he's going to be up there in the $20 million per year mark. This is certainly one to watch. Him and Khalil Mack with the Raiders. Those are your next major defensive contracts. Both are obviously on this list going forward, and I think both will be addressed this offseason, if not in the next couple of weeks. These are both teams who are in the mix. Both those guys are contributing as they should be, maybe a little under tick from last year. But these are major contracts coming down the pipeline soon.
Both players, going back to Robert's appearance earlier on the podcast, that play in California,
that's
that
right.
high-tax state.
Maybe not Khalil Mack for long.
Mack can't wait to get to Nevada.
That's right. Outside of that, a couple more names. Obviously, Odell Beckham Jr. So this is a situation where injuries have kind of come in with his contract situation, right? It's not just about talent and production and longevity, but this is a guy who's been injured a few times now. And he's obviously injured right now. So the Giants may have a situation where they can gain some leverage right now. He's not obviously at peak value. He had a decent start to the year before things went bad here injury-wise. And the Giants are just a mess as a whole right now. So they could be making some sweeping changes this offseason. But getting a guy like that under contract, maybe a little bit under the market value that he should be, it might be a nice step in the right direction for them going forward here. Another really interesting one is Drew Brees out in New Orleans. This is a 38-year-old guy. He's a 5,000 yards per year guy, but this year he's a little under that, right? He's projecting a little less. They're running the ball. They're winning, right? So everything's kind of working well in their favor. The situation with him is, in that 1-year extension last year, they handed him a signing bonus that prorates out another 3 years. It's $18 million for the next 3 years where he doesn't have a contract. That's just dead, voidable $18 million of dead cap sitting on the Saints. So not only does it behoove them from a football standpoint to keep him as a Saint and keep him as their quarterback for another year, but just in terms of being able to keep that dead cap allocated on a yearly basis. What do I mean by that? If they don't sign him back next year, all $18 million of that dead cap hits their 2018 cap right off the bat. It's a voidable dead cap. If they sign him to an extension, even a 1-year deal, $6 million of that stays with 2018 and just is included in his cap hit for next year, and the other 12 then voids in 2019. So by extending him, they're actually maneuvering that dead cap that already exists into a more manageable situation for them. So that's another one to watch. That's a Peyton Manning type contract where you're probably going to see maybe a little bit under the market, right? You're not going to see maybe $25 million for Drew Brees next year, maybe somewhere in the 18 to 20 mark, just to keep him obviously well paid. Move that dead cap around a little bit, and obviously keep yourself winning on the field like he's done this year. Fascinating,
all the things that they need to do, and as jokingly mentioned before, pay now or pay more later, and that's the way it works right now in the National Football League. The guys looking at extensions. The Beckham Jr. one is fascinating, right? Because he's going to be a $20 million receiver, wasn't he? Yeah. He still may be, but how could you pay him $20 million? That was a devastating injury.
Well, the price point right now is Antonio Brown's $17 million. So you're certainly thinking higher than that if you're him and his agent right now. But injuries, maybe a little bit less production in the last 18 months in terms of statistics. So like I said, timing is everything with these. And if teams and agents and them are starting right now, there's a better chance that the team gets a little bit better value. So we've got this article live on Spot Track right now. We take a look at every single team situation in terms of contract extension candidates, and we also take a look at some players who maybe might not be on the roster next year, some potential cuts. And we've got some interesting names there too. So take a look at the article, and as always, if you've got some comments and thoughts, hit us up at Spot Track on Twitter.
All right, maybe one of those players gets a deal in the next few days, and we'll have something more to be thankful about on Thanksgiving. I'm thankful to get to spend the time here, Mike, with you on Spot Track Podcast.
Yeah, this has been a great 6 weeks, and I want to thank Paul and Kevin and the guys at Buffalo Sports Page for helping us out and hosting and producing. And this has been a new experience for us, and hopefully an enjoyable one for our fans and our listeners out there, and we're going to keep this going as long as we can.
Yeah, the best is yet to come. SpotTrack.com, and thanks for the plug for Buffalo Sports Page, buffalosportspage.com, where our home office is in the two teams that we cover mainly aren't very good. They like to spend money.
That's good radio, though.
Yeah, that's right. You can look at all the contracts for the Buffalo sports teams, all the sports teams in all the leagues at SpotTrack.com. And on behalf of Mike and Paul, who's not here, I'm Kevin Sylvester. Have a great Thanksgiving, everybody.